The night I found out I was pregnant, it was raining. I remember standing in the bathroom of my tiny apartment, hands trembling as I held the test. The room was dim, lit only by the weak glow of a flickering ceiling light. Outside, the city hummed with the sound of passing cars and the soft hiss of water sliding down windows. 2 lines, faint, but clear. My first thought wasn't joy. It wasn't fear, either. It was silent, a hollow, echoing silence that filled my chest and wrapped around my ribs like wire. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, my hands resting over my stomach, not protectively. Not yet. Just there. As if to confirm that something had shifted, that I was no longer just one person, that I was no longer only responsible for myself. I didn't cry. I wish I had. Telling him the father was brief, clinical, unfeeling. He didn't yell. He didn't panic. He just blinked, ran a hand through his hair and said, "I can't do this." Then he left. He didn't call the next day, or the next week, or ever. I remember staring at my phone long after it had gone dark, waiting for a message that never came. At some point, I stopped checking. Then I stopped expecting. Then I stopped hoping. Some part of me broke in a quiet, irreversible way that day. I held on to the news for 2 more weeks, not because I was afraid, because I wanted to believe I still had something to lean on someone. So when I finally told my family, I thought they would at least try to understand. That maybe that beneath the disapproval and disappointment, there might be something soft left, something maternal, paternal, sibling-like. But I was wrong. I told them over dinner, sitting at the same table where we'd once celebrated birthdays and holidays and graduations. The air smelled like roast chicken and rosemary. My mother had folded the napkins into neat triangles. My father was already halfway through a glass of wine. My younger brother scrolled silently on his phone. When I said the words, "I'm going to have a baby," the room didn't erupt. It chilled. My mother stared at me like I'd spat in her food. My father set down his fork, slowly, carefully. My brother laughed just once, sharp and loud, then shook his head. They didn't yell. They didn't ask questions. They judged. They spoke about shame, about what will people say, about ruining my future, about how I'd let a man ruin me, about how I had embarrassed them. When I asked for support, not money, not a place to live, just presence, my mother said something I'll never forget. "If you want to live like a mistake, then don't expect us to clean it up." My father didn't even look at me. My brother muttered something under his breath and left the room. That was it. That was family. I packed my bag that night. A single duffel, a few clothes, my sketchbook, the prenatal vitamins I'd bought quietly, optimistically, thinking maybe this could still be beautiful. I didn't cry when I left. There was no one to cry to. The weeks that followed were a blur of long hours and longer nights. I worked double shifts at the diner. I took side jobs babysitting, dog walking, cleaning offices after closing. I ate cheap food and skipped meals. My body ached, my feet swelled, my back screamed. But I kept going, because inside me, something tiny and unknown was growing, and no one was going to love them but me. There were nights when the loneliness pressed in so close I thought I'd choke on it, nights when I whispered to my belly not for the baby, but for myself. Just to hear a voice, just to remember I still had one. People stared at me, sometimes in the grocery store, on the bus, like I was some cautionary tale. They didn't know the story. They only saw the label single mother. They didn't see the strength, the fight, the love that was already blooming, stubborn and bright, in a life that had been reduced to whispers and silence. I still dreamed of them sometimes, my family, not with anger, not with longing, just emptiness, like a missing tooth in the back of your mouth. You forget it's there until you bite the wrong way and feel the void again. But I kept moving forward because I had no choice and because I was no longer alone. Time passed in weeks, 7 weeks, 10, 14. The mornings came earlier, the nights felt longer. My body began to change, not all at once, but in small, unmistakable ways. The swell of my belly, the tightening of my breath, the soreness that nested in my bones like a second skin. I worked until my ankles screamed and my hands shook. The diner manager gave me the lighter shifts, but the pay was the same barely enough. I learned to make meals out of rice, canned beans, and the kindness of strangers. A neighbor once left a bag of groceries at my door. No note, no explanation, just quiet mercy. I held on to that. I held on to anything that didn't hurt. The nights were the hardest, when the world went still and my apartment filled with shadows. Doubt crept in like fog. Was I doing enough? Would I survive this? Would my child forgive me for bringing them into a world that had already closed so many doors? I used to imagine what it would have been like to have someone rub my back when the pain curled low and sharp, to have someone rub my temples when I couldn't sleep, to hear, "You're not alone," but there was only me and the slow, rhythmic movement inside me, a tiny flutter at first, then something stronger, a kick, a stretch, a response. And that was everything. Every little sign of life made the struggle matter. Every movement reminded me I am building something beautiful, even if no one sees it yet. I painted on cardboard I found in alleyways, sketched on the backs of receipts. I couldn't afford art supplies anymore, but I couldn't stop creating either. It was the only way I could make sense of the weight I carried, not just physically, but emotionally. I drew the shape of my hands, small feet, dreams, a future that hadn't been written yet. The day I went into labor, I was alone. It started as a dull ache. I was folding laundry tiny clothes I'd picked up secondhand from a donation center when the pain doubled me over. At first, I told myself it was too soon, that I had time, but the pain was steady, certain. I called a cab, packed the small hospital bag I'd kept by the door, left a note for the neighbor to feed the cat. At the hospital, they asked if anyone was coming. I said no. The nurse didn't look surprised. She just squeezed my hand and said, "You've got this." And I did. I wish I could tell you it was a magical moment. That time slowed down and music played and light poured in from the ceilings. But it was messy and painful and raw. And when they placed him on my chest, slick and screaming, I wept not from joy, not at first, but from relief, from exhaustion, from awe, from the realization that I had made it, that we had made it. My son, tiny, fragile, perfect. He opened his eyes and blinked slowly, like the world was too bright to take in all at once. And I whispered, "We're okay," because we were, because despite everything, despite the loneliness, the shame, the struggle, I had given birth not just to a child, but to a new version of myself, a mother. The first weeks were a blur of late-night feedings, diaper changes, and brief, trembling naps. There were moments I thought I'd break, moments I wanted to scream, moments I did. But every time I looked at him, I softened. He was the first person in my life who didn't ask me to be anything but present, who didn't care about mistakes or expectations, who just needed me, and I needed him too. I watched other mothers at the park, in cafes, on buses, the ones with husbands, strollers with cup holders, matching diaper bags. I felt the ache of comparison more times than I could count. But then I'd see him laugh, his first smile, his first grip around my finger, the way he stared at my face like it was the most familiar thing in the universe. And I knew what we had was enough. It wasn't easy, but it was ours. I didn't hear from my family. Not a word. They didn't ask if I was alive, or if the baby had been born, or if I had made it through. At first, I hated them for that. Then I pitied them. Then I let go. Because holding on to bitterness was like drinking salt water and hoping it would quench me. I didn't have room for resentment. I had diapers to change, bottles to warm, a little boy to love. And that love, it was quiet, it was fierce, it was enough to rebuild me. Day by day, we grew together. In the beginning, I measured success in small things: a full night's sleep, 3 hours uninterrupted, a clean shirt for me and the baby on the same day, a refrigerator that wasn't completely empty, laughter, sometimes in the dark. I didn't dream big. I dreamed in centimeters. I bought groceries without checking my bank balance twice. In a baby who was growing. In a woman who was beginning slowly to lift her own head again. The hardest part of being a single mother wasn't the work. It was carrying everything without ever being seen. The doctor's appointments, crying at 3 a.m., the budgeting down to the last dollar. The birthdays were planned with nothing but love and handmade cards. It was never having a witness. No one says, "You're doing great." No one to say, "I see you." So I learned to say it to myself, in the mirror, in the moments when I remembered to breathe. In the late nights when my son finally fell asleep and I sat on the floor, staring at the ceiling, both grateful and aching. When he turned 2, I enrolled in an online course in graphic design. It wasn't much, just a certificate, but I had always loved art, color, and composition. I needed something to rebuild my identity beyond bottles and bills. Something that reminded me I was more than a cautionary tale. More than a girl they had laughed at and left behind. I studied after he went to sleep, practiced on a secondhand laptop with missing keys, took free gigs designing flyers for local bakeries, birthday invitations, small logos. I charged next to nothing because it was all I had time, and grit, and the hope that maybe, one day, this would be enough to get us further. And slowly, people began to recommend me. A florist needed a website banner, a cafe wanted a new menu layout, a friend of a friend asked if I could design a children's book cover. I said yes, even when I didn't know how, especially then. Because there is a kind of strength born only in necessity, the kind that whispers, "You'll figure it out. You have to." By the time my son turned 4, we had moved into a slightly bigger apartment. It had 2 small rooms and a window that faced the sun in the morning. He had a bookshelf now, and a wall to tape his drawings on. I had a desk of my own, and a little savings tucked into a jar above the fridge. I wasn't rich, but I was building something I had never had before: stability. One afternoon, I took my son to the park. He was chasing pigeons and laughing the kind of wild, bubbling laughter that only a child can produce, and I sat on the bench, watching him, sipping cold coffee from a paper cup. A woman sat beside me. She was older, elegant, the kind of woman who wore silk scarves and sunglasses even in the shade. She smiled at my son, then turned to me. "Are you his nanny?" she asked gently. It wasn't cruel, just curious. I hesitated, then said, "No, I'm his mother." She blinked. "Oh," and then, after a long pause, "He looks happy." I nodded. "He is." She didn't ask anything else. She didn't need to, because that was it. That was the truth I had earned. He was happy, and I had built that alone. Sometimes I still think about them, my family, where they were, what they told people when someone asked about me, whether they ever looked at an empty chair during dinner and thought, maybe we were wrong. But I no longer lived with those questions. I lived in our routines, our small joys, my son's little hands tugging on my shirt, saying, look, Mama, and me, always looking, always proud. Until one day, years later, the past came knocking, not metaphorically, literally. A letter, a name on the envelope I hadn't seen in 5 years. Inside a request, short, measured, desperate. They needed help. Everything had changed, and I was the only one they could turn to. The letter was written in my mother's handwriting. Even after all those years, I recognized the way she curved her R's and looped her Y's. There was no greeting, no dear, no warmth, just 4 lines brief, formal, like a business transaction. Your father's business collapsed. We may lose the house. We need your help. I know we don't deserve it, but please, come home. I stared at the paper for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt still. For days, I didn't respond. Not out of anger, just uncertainty. Because I had spent years stitching myself back together from the silence they'd wrapped me in. I had built a life from scraps, dignity from nothing. I didn't want to go back into the house where my name had once been spoken like an embarrassment, where my pregnancy had been treated like betrayal, where I had been erased without apology. But I kept thinking of the boy now asleep in the next room, the boy who asked questions like, do I have a grandpa, and why don't we visit your family? And the part of me that had once wanted revenge now just wanted closure. Not to prove anything, but to finally lay it all down. So I packed a small bag. I dressed my son in his favorite yellow sweater, the one with the tiny stitched bear on the sleeve, and we took the bus back to the town I once ran from. The landscape hadn't changed much. Same cracked sidewalks, same overgrown hedges. The house still stood tall and proud, though the paint was peeling near the windows, and the yard hadn't been trimmed in months. It looked tired. I understood that. My mother opened the door. She looked older, not just in her face, but in the way she held herself, like the years had pressed down on her shoulders, like silence had grown heavy. She didn't hug me, didn't reach for my son. She simply stepped aside and said, come in. We entered the home where I had once been told to leave and never come back. The hallway smelled the same pine cleaner and something faintly floral. My son clutched my hand tightly, his eyes wide, unsure of the space. I bent down and whispered, it's okay. I wasn't sure if I said it for him or for me. My father sat in the living room, the man who hadn't spoken my name in 5 years. He looked smaller somehow, not just thinner, but faded. His suit jacket hung loose on him. His hands trembled slightly as he stood. When his eyes met mine, I saw something I never expected to find there. Not pride, not control, but loss, and something dangerously close to regret. The conversation was short. The business had failed. A string of bad investments, market shifts, debt they couldn't outrun. The bank was moving on the house. They'd sold off what they could, but it wasn't enough. My brother had moved overseas, distancing himself from the fallout. There was no one left to ask, except me. I listened, not coldly, not kindly, just steadily. When they finished, they looked at me not like a daughter, but like a lifeline, and I realized the shame they once pushed onto me had come back home to live with them. I looked around the room, the same place where they once told me I was a disgrace, where they turned their backs and closed the door behind me, and I saw what they couldn't then, that I had left with nothing but returned with everything. I didn't say yes, not right away. I stood, took my son's hand, said we needed time. We stayed at a nearby inn that night, small, clean, quiet. My son drew on a napkin while I stared at the ceiling. He asked me, "Is this your old house?" I nodded. Why didn't we come before I paused? Then said, "Because they weren't ready to love us yet." He didn't ask more. He just leaned against me and said, "I do." That night, I made my decision. Not for them, for me. Because forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means no longer letting the pain write your story. I returned to the house the next morning with a decision, not a debt. I didn't bring a suitcase of money. I didn't bring paperwork or conditions. I brought a simple envelope, names, numbers, the contact of a lawyer I trusted, and 2 financial advisors who had helped me grow my business over the last few years. Inside that envelope was a way out, a way for them to keep the house, a way to survive the wreckage they had built for themselves. My mother opened it in silence. My father's hands hovered over the edge like he wasn't sure whether to reach or recoil. I didn't ask them to thank me, because this wasn't for them. It was for the girl I had been, the one who had once stood trembling in this very room. Belly swollen, heartbreaking, eyes searching every corner for someone who would stay. That girl deserved closure, and I gave it to her myself. I stayed 2 days, not out of guilt, not out of duty, but because I wanted them to see who I had become, not in words, but in presence, in how my son smiled when he helped me stir his cereal, in how I held myself now, not smaller, not apologetically, in how I no longer sought their approval like air. The second night, my father asked if I could sit with him on the back porch. We said very little. He talked about the weather, about how fast the seasons had changed, about the tree he planted when I was born, how its branches now stretched past the roof. Then, after a long pause, he said, "You did it. Without us." There was no pride in his voice, just a quiet knowing, a thread of something that sounded like shame, twisted with awe. I didn't answer. I just looked up at the tree. Its roots had found a way, even when the ground had been hard. My mother offered us the guest room for the night. She placed clean sheets on the bed, fluffed the pillows twice, then left a small nightlight near the dresser. She never said sorry. But in the morning, she packed sandwiches for us to take on the road, cut off the crust the way I used to like, folded a napkin with a drawing my son had left on the table, slipped it into my bag without saying anything, and that was enough. We left without ceremony. My son waved goodbye from the car window, and my parents stood in the doorway awkward, still, uncertain of how to exist in the space between past and future. I didn't promise to return. They didn't ask. But something had shifted. The mocking had fallen away. The shame no longer echoed between us. And in its place was something quieter, more fragile recognition, not of who I once was, but of who I had become. Today, my son is 6. He has a steady hand, a loud laugh, and eyes that see more than most people ever will. I run my own design studio now, small that's independent, honest work. I create things that make people feel something, branding for family businesses, illustrations for children's books, even a series of portraits of single mothers who, like me, were told they wouldn't make it. Sometimes, I speak at shelters, not about success, but about dignity, about how to keep moving when the world insists you should collapse. Every so often, my mother sends photos of the house, the garden, that old tree. My father has started teaching my son how to play chess over video calls. It's awkward and imperfect, a relationship built slowly from the splinters of the one we never had, but it's real, and that's more than I ever expected. They mocked me when I needed them most, but I chose not to become the version of myself their laughter tried to shape. I chose love. I chose survival. I chose softness that didn't bend to their hardness. And in the end, they came to me not because they changed, but because I did.